department, it became a system where officers were rewarded for the number of arrests, the quotas that they made, and the numbers of arrests that they got, and they were disciplined and sanctioned for fewer arrests. And so it wasn't just if I want to be rewarded or promoted, I have to get arrested. It's also if I don't want to be penalized or lose my job or have some other kind of employment trouble, I have to make these arrests. A lot of times during that time, a lot of officers, you know, low-level officers, Black officers, really complained. They felt a lot of stress about the pressure to make all of the numbers. Nonetheless, that was the policy that prevailed. What's completely important too is that out of those 750,000 arrests, between 1/3 and 1/2 of all of the arrests were illegal arrests. Illegal arrests are arrests that are not based upon probable cause. There's no warrant, which warrants are based upon probable cause. But even before you get to the point of being eligible for a warrant, you have to have probable cause that criminal activity is afoot. A Black man standing in his yard is not probable cause. A Black person walking down the street is not probable cause. Being Black and doing any activity is not probable cause for arrest. I don't care if you live in a high crime area, or even if there's been some report of criminal activity afoot. But what happened is it became commonplace for the ruse of a crime being reported or a high crime area to be the premise for which arresting people was acceptable. And just to sum up on this, what I've seen personally in my career, because outside of being in the House of Delegates and now a senator, I'm primarily a criminal defense attorney for most of my career. And what was going on in those years, for example, is there's a murder reported, someone's killed. Every single person that is outside in a 3-block radius is arrested. People might be outside just talking to their friends. They might be outside shooting dice. They might be outside smoking marijuana or copping, whatever. But they're all arrested under the guise of, you know, we have a murder investigation, and basically they're Black there in the area, and that happens. What happened, the crime in that is beyond just the arrest that's not based upon probable cause. In those days, people that were arrested and taken to central booking, there was no 24-hour requirement that they see a commissioner to have a determination made about release. In addition to that, because the charge is murder, there was going to be no release. There was going to be no bail. And so what happens? 16-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 21-year-olds are arrested and they're held. They don't see a commissioner timely. Even when they do, they don't get a bail. They're held for 6 months, 7 months, 8 months. Charges are ultimately null-prossed. They've lost their life. They've been abused. They've been tortured in central booking. And what we have today in Baltimore City, in large part, are the repercussions of young people and not so young people that had that type of experience from it. Well, it was under O'Malley, it was 1999 to 2006. Let's be clear. It didn't begin or end there. Unjust policing didn't begin or end there. That's just when it happened en masse. And so we are still dealing with the repercussions of that policy.
You're absolutely right, Senator. It did not begin there. There is a whole ideology and policies that were put in place on a national level that informed then Mayor Martin O'Malley's police strategy. Part of that strategy included recruiting then Baltimore City Police Commissioner Ed Norris, who eventually would go on to be indicted and sent to prison himself. But Davon, if you will, can you talk about that ideology that helped fuel and shape and made that possible particularly when we were looking at what was happening in the country. And folks, the context of this is to understand that this is not a Baltimore issue. We have folks that's joining us outside of Maryland this evening, that this is not a Baltimore issue, not a Maryland issue. This is an issue throughout our country. But it's important to understand some key legislation and key decisions that were being made on a national level, a federal level, particularly when we look at then President Bill Clinton's crime bill, also looking at New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani policing strategy as it evolves around broken windows. Again, putting in the context that O'Malley's first pick for police commissioner was Ed Norris, who came from New York City. Can you help put that in context for us even more, Davon, please?
Absolutely. So just to provide a little bit more history, one of the ways that I think this question of policing and social work intersect is because when we look at the, one of the things that's a core part of the collective American consciousness is the notion of inherent Black pathology, this notion that Black folks are inherently criminal. And we saw that being weaponized, particularly when you look at the Nixon administration and the launch of the war on drugs. And you think about some of his aides, a guy named John Ehrlichman, who was very explicit in saying, what we're going to do is we're going to equate Black people to crime. And so instead of saying we're going to go after Black people, we're going to use crime as the dog whistle, as the proxy for talking about Black people, and construct a policy, which is the war on drugs, to take advantage of sentiment of white working class and rural white folks whose resentment stemmed from what they would call their perception or the perceived gains of the civil rights movement for Black people. Right? This notion that Black people are getting benefits and they're being left behind. And that dynamic is a historical one, right? Where white folks, the kind of cultural machinery of whiteness, and this idea of white folks clinging existentially to this belief in their whiteness as a core part of their humanity, is the backdrop for a lot of what animates a lot of these policies. And so when we talk about the notion of Black people being inherently criminal, right? The reason the war on drugs makes sense, and the reason that Ehrlichman of the Nixon administration can make such a comment and craft a political strategy around it, was because in the United States, there is and around the globe, there is a resonance on this notion of Black people being inherently violent. You can look at one of the first motion picture films, Birth of a Nation, where one of the core plot lines is a Black man attempting to rape a white woman. And of course, the Black man was a white person in blackface. But that was one of the key plots in that major motion picture film that was screened in the White House, right? And so I can give a bunch of examples, but again, the point I want to make is that this notion of Black people being inherently pathological and criminal is what then animates the perceptions that drive the policies around mass incarceration. And so when you get then to Clinton, because the decision that the Democrats made, particularly in the late 80s and 90s, was that they had to pivot, right? Because a part of the pivot that they made was tacking to the center, right? And not being, so progressive, right? So that's why even if you look at like some of the presidential primaries, you look at Bernie Sanders and you see some of the famous clips of him opposing the 1984 crime bill, folks like him were in the minority, right? And in fact, one of the things I thought was really sad, watching the 2016 presidential primary, is having to watch Congressman Bobby Rush, who's a former member of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Chicago, on television apologize for being a person in Congress in the 90s that supported and pushed the crime bill, right? And so I think that, again, it's important part to what's important to be clear about is this notion of inherent Black pathology, whether you're, a white person in power or Black people who are in elected office. And I think one of the things that Senator Carter has taught me is that one of the unfortunate narratives or reality really, in the leadership in Baltimore, and I'm sure places like Baltimore, is that there are ways in which Black people operationalize this notion of Black people being inherently pathological. The last thing, and that results in these policies, right? And so there's a role that Black elected officials and civic leaders played in actuating the policy of mass incarceration. Latest things I'll say about this, for now, is that I want to really highlight the fact that as a result, this underlying notion of inherent criminality of Black people, there are political and social rewards for being a person who subscribes to that notion. And it's really important to know. Like, Martin O'Malley made a career off of the decimation of Black people, right? He was at the time a star of the Democratic Party, right? And his stardom was dependent on the perception of him dealing with the problem of public safety in Baltimore, right? He, like Senator Carter, he came from Montgomery County, right? And it's important to note that it is that kind of political calculation that is directed against the humanity of Black people that actually is that serves as the basis for the political benefits that a lot of people in public office. And again, that's why even mentioning Bobby Rush, it's like there are lots of Black folks who we otherwise would respect, right? Who were proponents of that policy. And I think it's important that as a community, we hold our community accountable for the ways that we might propagate this notion of Black people being inherently violent.
Thank you. Real quick, folks, Tony Holness, Public Policy Director of ACLU of Maryland, joined us while Davon was talking. How you doing, Tony? Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
No problem. Thank you for joining us. Senator Carter, Davon touched on a very interesting point with Congressman Bobby Rush and the CBC Congressional Black Caucus support of legislation like the crime bill. And at the time, folks can make the strong argument about how best ways to address crime during the 80s and the 90s. And particularly with the rise of the crack epidemic, everyone was trying to find a solution, a quick, fast, easy one, particularly for the detriment of the Black people, to the detriment of Black people, excuse me, was harsh policing. When we have that conversation, and it's a real and an honest conversation, as you already know, about public safety in our communities, public safety in Baltimore City, as we wrestle with homicide rate that's been stubborn and for years. When we look at that in that context, where are we in terms of measuring that in juxtaposition with policing, how it should be in our community? Because people can have a valid argument that the homicides are out of control, and no one wants that. But how do we wrestle with that as well as public safety in our communities?
So I believe everything is driven by politics and political leadership. And when you have political leaders, being in the city of Baltimore, the mayor and city council, who have set the policies for decades, and in the era of Martin O'Malley, when he became very powerful, but even before him with Kurt Schmoke and the city council, we've always had, as you know, a very strong mayor system. So the city council is a little less relevant. They pretty much, for the most part, as many of you know, been rubber stamps of whatever the mayor's agenda was. And what's important is that the same political decisions that gutted resources from Black communities, the same political decisions that deprived Black communities of resources, opportunities, job opportunities, employment opportunities, career opportunities, educational equity, as you know from all the way back in the day when the Bradford case surfaced in the 90s until today when you see Kerwin, that Baltimore City has always been unconstitutionally underfunded and deprived of its right under the Constitution, the children here, to a thorough and efficient system of education. That's important because the same people that have created an environment of hopelessness, of less than, of lack of opportunity, are the same ones that then choose to crack down on the victims of those policies with harsher policing. And so the solution is to change the conditions of the people, not to decide, as has been decided here and everywhere, with the system of mass incarceration, primarily under the guise of cracking down on drugs. And then finally, in Baltimore City in particular, what is most disturbing to me, and this is a real nexus, there is a real nexus between children that are poisoned by lead and criminality. And we continue to have, in 2020, in 2020, we continue to have hundreds of children every year still being lead poisoned. But in that era, in the 80s and the 90s, it was in the thousands. Thousands of children every year, not every 10 years, thousands of children being poisoned by lead. Numerous studies have determined and pointed out and reported that lead poisoning is a precursor to school delinquency, juvenile delinquency, and criminal activity, because children that are poisoned by lead often are unable to control their impulses in the same ways that those of us that aren't are. And so the little situations like disputes and anger is poorly managed, and they often are the ones that also are distracted, have ADHD, can't pay attention in school. There is a direct nexus in Baltimore City between lead poisoned children and the criminal milieu, so to speak. And so my point is that it's, just follow me on this. Lead poisoning is 100% preventable. The only reason that we have never prevented it, the only reason that we have never eliminated lead poisoning is because politicians are more concerned about staying in bed with the property owners that make the profits from the lead poisoning, lead infested housing stock, than they are saving the lives and protecting the futures of Black children. And so I would just sum up by saying that I believe that you always have to start at the beginning, and if your premise is wrong, then your conclusion will be wrong. And so if the premises, we start at the beginning with how we decide to nurture and raise and guide our children. If we're allowing children to be lead poisoned, have inequitable education, and then no opportunities for employment or entrepreneurship or making any money outside of the drug trade, which is a whole other story that Davon brought up with the Nixon administration and the fact that it was intentional to infest our communities with illegal drugs, basically. My point is that we wouldn't have a crime problem in the streets if we didn't have a crime problem in the streets, which my father and many people from the 60s said is the way that I would sum that up. And so, yeah, we don't want people killing each other, but we're never going to stop that until we change the conditions of people and the mentality of people.
Tony, I want to go to you really quickly. Leading up to 2015, the legislative session of 2015, that is also the year we lost Freddie Gray, and also the year of the uprising. But leading up to that year, Baltimore experienced, and not just Baltimore, excuse me, the state of Maryland experienced several losses due to police violence. Did not make national news, but we lost Anthony Anderson. We lost Tyrone West. We lost Christopher Brown in Baltimore County. These are just a few of the names. And forgive me, these are the ones that come to the top of my mind right now. But these are just few of the names of folks that we lost to Corinne Gaines, yes, for Corinne Gaines, who also we lost in Baltimore County. Just some of the few of the names that come to my mind. Can you take us back to 2015, Tony, with your efforts as an advocate, policy advocate, trying to fight with police reform that some would say a minimum progress, some say wasn't enough, definitely something to scarf at. Before you speak, really quick, I want to put in context that same year, the Justice Policy Institute released a report, I believe was February of that year. They released a report detailing the zip codes in the state of Maryland with the highest level of people incarcerated. If I'm not mistaken, I believe 3 of those zip codes were in Baltimore City. So please, Tony, take us back to what was happening that legislative session in 2015, prior to the uprising, prior to Freddie Gray, with your efforts for police reform.
Thanks, Bobby. And I apologize to folks for getting on a little bit late, but thank you for having me. And I'm glad you started the timeline with that legislative session. Of course, that's not where the work started, but in 2015, Senator Carter had introduced a bill to amend Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, the LEOBR. And I remember very clearly, it was the Senate President, Mike Miller, who said, "This is not Ferguson. We don't need to do that. We don't need that here. This is not Ferguson," right? And then, of course, as soon as the session closed, and there were some other police reforms introduced that year as well, but that one, I think, became really relevant as we moved through the following years. And then the session closed. Go ahead, Bob.
Quickly, Tony, can you let people know what is the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights here in Maryland? Exactly what is that?
Sure. So the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights is a statute that lives in the public safety article in Maryland, in our laws. And what it does is it codifies certain special rules and protections for police officers who are facing discipline. These are rules that go above and beyond any other protections that state and local government employees have. Rules at the time, they had a 10-day waiting period for an officer who was being investigated for misconduct, where the officer could lawyer up, line up his story with the other officers on the scene, look at the files, and just get their ducks in a row so they would be less likely to face discipline. That's one of so many provisions that prevent officers from being held accountable when they've conducted themselves in any kind of improper way. So that's what the law, and just so folks have some national context, I believe it is 17 other states that have a Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. So we are in the minority here in Maryland. Maryland had the first LEOBR. We have one of the worst LEOBRs in the country, and we are in the minority of states. Most states do not give these kinds of protections to their police officers. So in 2015, for like more than good reason, Senator Carter introduced this bill to amend the LEOBR, not even repeal it, just to amend it. And it was, the effort was dismissed as not being necessary because, like I said, or like President Miller said, this wasn't Ferguson, right? And of course, shortly after the session closed, Freddie Gray was killed. And we saw I'm looking at the names to see how like direct I can be. It's a standard operating procedure, cover your ass move by the General Assembly to pull together a work group. They pulled together a work group to study the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. And who's the one person they did not include in that work group was Senator Carter, then Delegate Carter, who was the only legislator who had introduced a bill on the topic. And so, that gives you a sense, because the General Assembly, the leadership is incredibly artful at propagating this image of addressing a problem without actually creating a mechanism for it for the solution to actually remedy the issue, right? It's just it's just very, very clever, I guess is the nice way to put it. And so they pulled together this work group, which met throughout the summer. and then produced some recommendations, which were by and large cosmetic. In fact, entirely cosmetic, as far as what reforms to policing and the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights specifically they were willing to make. And even that very meager list of reforms that the work group recommended, did not make it through to final passage the following legislative session in 2016. I think it's important to recognize that that play-by-play is exactly what is happening now. The General Assembly had several bills to address policing reform this session. They passed none of them, not a one. And then now we have an uprising again, and they've pulled together a work group again. And, so we should not expect the same group of folks who have been sitting on their behinds, Senator Carter excluded, for years to now be enlightened, because they just really, they are not going to be the drivers of the solution, and they will not produce any reforms to policing unless they are absolutely pushed to the limit. Well, maybe later I'll tell you how I really feel.
Thank you, Tony. I think that context was very important. I know the work has been going on for years, but I think definitely it came into a lot of folks' consciousness due to the tension locally and across the state as well as nationally. So I just want to provide context to folks that this work was already taking place. Baltimore, the state of Maryland, didn't decide to join the bandwagon at the last minute, or when Ferguson happened, or any of the deaths of Black folks across the country. The state of Maryland was already working on this issue for years. And I thought it was also important to lay out the barriers to holding police accountable. Davon, I want to bring you in to talk about your perspective during that time, because you, Leaders for Beautiful Struggle, was in Annapolis trying to take action at that point in time. Senator Carter, I definitely want to go to you next for you to lay out, because definitely you have insight that no one has in terms of what was the barriers. And to be quite frankly, as a constituent, what is it that our representatives, our lawmakers aren't doing that should be doing in terms of representing us and assuring that public safety is achieved, as well as accountability for our police agencies. So Davon, real quick, and then you, Senator Carter.
So two things I want to touch on. The first is that it's hard to overstate the extent to which the Fraternal Order of Police as an institution has been, one of the biggest impediments to police reform. The Fraternal Order being the police union. And it's important for people to note that the budget, 1/3 of the budget of the Baltimore City's budget goes to law enforcement, right? Broke $500 million the past couple of years. The FOP, the way that I kind of characterize them is that in many respects, they're a special interest group that is financed by public dollars to advocate against the interests of the people they're supposed to protect. And furthermore, it's important to put in perspective law enforcement as an institution and the culture of law enforcement. If you look at it historically, right, these are folks that collaborated with programs like the Counterintelligence Program to disrupt, movements for freedom and liberation that were responsible for political assassinations of people like Fred Hampton in Chicago, responsible for, framing people like Eddie Conway, who the Black Panther that spent 44 years behind bars. Folks that are, urged the federal administration to up the bounty on Assad Shakur to try to extradite her and bring her back to, from Cuba. The FOP's politics, the culture of it, right? And there's also, historical evidence of, the kind of alt-right Klan elements of the 40s and 50s, strategically moving into law enforcement. So law enforcement has a culture that has a long history and roots in undermining Black people, challenging the status quo. And so that institution that still exists operates from that very perspective. And if you watch and if you look at some of the things that they put out on social media, some of the things that they've, put out into the public, it tells you everything you need to know about the perspective that the Fraternal Order of Police is coming from. And so they serve as a major barrier. And there was a period of time prior to the uprising, prior to the Gun Trace Task Force, where officers were federally indicted for, robbing people, selling drugs, planting guns on people. Prior to those two incidences, it was hard to get many of the legislators, particularly those in prominent positions, to do anything contrary to what the FOP want, right? There are people who would say, if the FOP doesn't want it, we don't move on. Now, we're only at a place where we can start to move stuff in spite of the FOP because of the uprising, because of the Gun Trace Task Force, because of this kind of contemporary social context. But it's really important for people to know that that is kind of the anchor of the really important barrier. And the second thing I want to say this about the question that you put to Senator Carter. It's important for people to know that, because when we talk about like the tough on crime policies, we're talking about things like mandatory minimums and sentence enhancements and stuff like that. And it's really important for people to know that those policies actually do not improve public safety. Because I think sometimes people think that if you take a policy or a penalty and you go from 5 to 10, that means that you're going to be able to get the people who are causing murders. And in fact, what actually ends up happening is that when you enhance sentences, you're not enhancing the ability for law enforcement to go after the people that are really the drivers of violence. You're essentially sentencing people who get sucked into the criminal justice system to more time. And so if we're serious about addressing, homicide, to the extent that we are stuck with the current formation of public safety and law enforcement, the quality of their ability to pursue people that are actually the drivers of violence and crime is the issue if you want to address homicide and violence. Sentence enhancements, harsher penalties don't get at the question of violence, don't get at the question of homicide. And in fact, what you end up doing is you end up bringing more people into the criminal justice system that then become proximate to people who have engaged in crime and violence, and you make people more prone to criminality. So I just wanted to add that to make sure that people get context, because I think sometimes people make them like in opposition to each other. That if you have police accountability, where you're sacrificing safety, for the community, and in fact, it's the opposite. That if you have law enforcement that's not accountable, they probably aren't going to be able to effectively do the job we want them to do, which is to actually address violence.
Thank you, Devon. Definitely, that context is needed when we talk about public safety. Senator Carter, can you please can you share insight and your experience in the legislature dealing with police reform? You dealing with it for years, but particularly when we look at 2015 efforts prior to the uprising, and in 2016 efforts following the uprising. I believe at the time, 2015, correct me if I'm wrong, you were sitting on a judiciary committee that's responsible for reviewing this legislation. Please walk us through what was happening.
Sure. Really quickly. It's interesting because Devon, when he talked, it reminded me of something that is really so true about us. We believe the stories that we know that happened to Assata Shakur, that she was framed. We believe and know about what happened to other members of the Black Panther Party. We believe and know about COINTELPRO. We believe and know more recently, in recent years, about the exonerated 5, the young guys in Central Park that were completely framed. Yet somehow we still fundamentally don't, I think, fully understand and believe that that is law enforcement, that is the criminal justice system, that is the same system that we entrust to somehow be right or correct in most of its decisions. We somehow think these are the exceptions, and I would submit to you that they are not the exceptions. That is the way the system works. And in Baltimore City in particular, the place that we went back to in the O'Malley years, that is exactly the way the system worked. You were guilty until proven innocent, and most people couldn't afford to prove themselves innocent. But that being said, the legislature, Tony hit the nail on the head, so there's nothing more to say. She basically said the legislature had no will to pass reform legislation, no desire, no will. Davon said that the FOP has way too much power. You know, what's very interesting is that even though it's come out in recent reports that FOP gives donations to various legislators and the like, to be quite honest with you, that little pittance of the $500 or $1,000 they give is not enough to really buy a legislator. So I don't believe, for those of you that believe, oh, well, it's the donation. It's not the donation. If the Senate president has $2 million, $1,000 from the FOP didn't really do that much for him. Now, granted, they may bundle the money and have other sources, but I don't believe it's about the money at all. The money is not the power with the FOP. I actually believe that the legislature is a very leadership-driven place. Just like the Baltimore City Police Department under the O'Malley era, you are rewarded for how much you support a leadership agenda, and you are punished if you go against a leadership agenda. Because it is a Democratic body, because the Senate president has been and is a Democrat, and because the House Speaker has been and is a Democrat, if you are a Democrat, you are absolutely not permitted to go against their agenda. And the agenda was set that we are going to basically talk to the FOP, we're going to basically talk to the chiefs and sheriffs, and we're going to ask them, what are you willing to give? What are you willing to negotiate? What are you willing to give up? And they're basically going to continually say nothing. And so then they come back with this narrative that we can't do anything, we can't make any change. They never put the interest of our constituents, the interest of Black people who are most victimized and most impacted, they never put us first. They put law enforcement first. That's what the leadership does, and that's what most legislators do. They follow suit of the leadership. But I also think there's just fundamentally this resistance to radically change anything. The idea to make change is something that is scary to most legislators. And so how do we fix that and how do we change that? Because Tony just said, we're exactly in the same place we were in 2015. And that's a horrible idea, isn't it? I mean, after Freddie Gray, and what most people don't know, and you talked about the people that are killed by police that don't make the news, which is the overwhelming majority, because since 2015, there have been more than 130 people killed in Maryland by law enforcement since 2015. We don't know the names because they don't make the news. So what's important is you can't rely on your legislators to do the right thing here. You can't trust that because they came to your house and stood on your doorstep and had a nice lot of good things to say, that when they get into the committee rooms in Annapolis, they're going to do right on this issue or any issue. You have to stay in their face and you have to stay involved. Over these next few months, there's going to be a lot of buzz around police reform. The Senate, in the last 2 weeks of September, we are going to hold hearings on, at this point, it's about between 35 and 40 bills on police reform, okay? Some of them are just window dressing, cosmetic bills that they always want to do, but they kind of like run the gamut, everything from, military supplies going to local law enforcement agencies to repealing the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights and kind of everything in between. And I would just put out there, the first thing to do is put that on your agenda to participate in those Senate hearings. Also, even though we know that they're not serious, as we heard from Tony earlier, it's also important to follow the House work group. So the Senate is going to hold hearings on bills. The House work group is simply going to grapple with the issue and ostensibly make recommendations on bills for the January session. But we're actually going to hear actual bills in September, and we'll be ostensibly ready to vote on them in January. What is important about that is that for a bill to become a law, it must pass both houses. And the fact that the General Assembly is not having any type of cohesion or notable collaboration between the House and the Senate should be a red flag to everybody that something is amiss here, that this narrative that we're going to address police reform is not authentic. And then finally, I want to say one other thing that you didn't ask me, but it's so important. We have a new speaker, and she's the first Black woman to ever be the speaker. And many of us, especially those in the House of Delegates, they wish her well, they root for her, and they are giving her 100% support. We also have a new Senate president, and many of us like him. We believe he is more progressive and more sensitive to our issues and community than the former Senate president, Mike Miller. And what I saw this last session from many legislators was a tendency to not want to push up against these two new leaders because they don't want to, one, get on their bad side, but number two, they're generally rooting for them. Like, they want them to do well and they want to be on their good side. And so it is important more than ever that the people step in and hold everyone accountable, because I have a real fear that people I deeply respect in the House of Delegates are not going to want to embarrass the House Speaker. They're going to want to go along with the agenda. And I can tell you, and I like her, I respect her, but we've seen in recent weeks that the House has decided that the answer for them lies in writing a letter to Governor Hogan, and saying, we need you to issue an executive order on these police reforms now. As you brought up, Bobby, police reform has been on the table since before 2015. I think I had my first bill to have an independent trial board back in 2009 or something. So these bills have been on the table forever. For the House or the Senate or anybody to take a position that is suddenly incumbent upon Governor Hogan to issue an executive order, when many of these bills, as Tony brought up, have never been voted on even last session, to me, that's a red flag that something is amiss and there's an effort to deflect attention. And finally, these policy things that you'll hear about, ending chokeholds and, stopping other types of policies like that. That's, to me, also a deflection from the real issue. We should never engage in a discussion about the ways that law enforcement is allowed to kill us. The conversation must be, they are never allowed to kill us, that necessity, defensive life must be the only standard, that it could ever happen, and that we must repeal the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, which has basically been one of the greatest mechanisms that has allowed them to get away with this forever. No transparency, no accountability. The Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights governs all police investigations and all discipline. We get rid of that, and we're able to then hold police accountable.
Really quick, Senator, the hearings that you mentioned, the one in late September by the Senate and the one that will be hosted by the House, are there dates yet, or they're still up in the air?
No, I'll keep you posted, but I talked to the chairman today, and he simply said there are no dates, but they will occur in the second 2 weeks of September, so the second half of September. Okay,
all right, and I know they will be public. I imagine.
Oh, they'll be public.
Yes,
probably virtually public, but they'll be public.
Yes, ma'am. Give folks the opportunity to weigh in. I know everyone on this panel can talk about all of these issues. I'm well aware, and I knew that when I reached out. I definitely want to hear from everyone as far as perspective. I think is very important. Tony, can you explain what type of strides, if any, what changes were made to the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights Also, I think it is important to address other legislation on the table, because the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights is not the end all be all to police reform and police accountability. So can you address what has changed with the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights as of 2016 legislative session?
Sure. So the 2016 reforms to the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights included scaling down that 10-day waiting period that I mentioned earlier to 5 days. So what? They removed a notarization.
What does that mean, Tony? The 5 to 10 days. What does that mean exactly?
Sure. So when an officer is being accused of misconduct, she or he has 10 days where they are not allowed to be interrogated, investigated about the offense, the infraction. They scale that down from 10 days to 5 days. So, which is ridiculous. And when you talk to victims and survivors of police misconduct, they'll tell you like nobody gave them any time. They had to talk about what they experienced, like right there on the scene. And yet the officers are given 5 days now to line their stories up. The 2016 bill also, it removed a requirement at the time that excessive force complaints be notarized. So they no longer need to be notarized. The General Assembly was not willing to allow anonymous police complaints, but they did allow for third-party complaints, but only from individuals with firsthand knowledge because they had a video recording. It's just, the time frame for brutality complaints. Before 2016, brutality complaints had to be filed within 90 days of the offense. And that was extended to 366 days. I'm forgetting right now why it was important to be over a year. Jill probably knows. But there was something that was related to another statute of limitations, I think, that was 1 year. Bobby, so I have my synopsis of the LEOBR bill is long and it's a synopsis. But I think I wanna stop. I can send it to you if folks want to see exactly what was included in the 2016 bill. But I feel like the measure of what was actually done is what was the impact, and I think the impact was nothing. And so, there will have some General Assembly members, leadership who want to say that, they did something in 2016, that, they did pass meaningful reform. And I think the question that we have to pose back to them is, well, what difference did it make? And if the answer is none, then you didn't do enough. Whatever you did, it was not enough. Whatever you've been doing in the years between introducing bills and calling on Governor Hogan, and let me just say this, I have to talk about that. The call on Governor Hogan to issue an executive order when the General Assembly has shown nothing but inertia is so inauthentic. It is just, it's completely inauthentic. There is no way anyone who signed that petition thought that it would actually be well received by the governor and that the governor would respond positively to it. There's no way. It was clearly a performative measure to gesture as if we are too foolish to understand that the General Assembly could have done this themselves and still has the power to do it themselves. So I just have to say that because it was like salt in the wound when they issued this letter to the governor, which was just inauthentic, I guess is the way I can say it. But Bobby, I'll be happy to send out a list of the reforms. The list is very long. The meaningfulness of it is empty. They changed a lot of words that didn't make a lot of difference in people's lives. I'll say it that way.
Thank you, Tony.
Civilian Review Board is 365 days, Tony. I think that's what you were.
Thank you.
I think that information is important. Right now, this panel, we really want to be an education session for folks as well, because a lot of folks just don't know, are not aware of these legislation, are not aware that there's actually a statute that pretty much protects police officers in the state of Maryland and makes it very difficult to prosecute them. So that's why I thought it was so important to dig into the details of this policy. Folks, we're going to start taking questions for the panel at 8:10. Before we do so, Davon, I wanted to ask you about the Civilian Review Board and its significance.
Yep. So I think a couple of things about the Civilian Review Board. It was created in statute in 1999. And part of the problem with the Civilian Review Board is that very similar to when Tony read off the things that were changed in the 2016 bill, how much of it was just window dressing. Similarly, with the Civilian Review Board statute of 99, when they were establishing it, the Civilian Review Board doesn't have a lot of power, doesn't have a lot of money, right? Doesn't have a lot of capacity. And so part of the issue is that even though we have a Civilian Review Board, I think we're one of 2 jurisdictions in the state that have one, that statutorily is supposed to be independent from the city. So it's supposed to be kind of its own standalone agency. It currently lives within a city government agency for the moment, which does present some challenges in terms of being able to actually hold law enforcement accountable. And so, and of course, Senator Carter, the past couple of sessions, has put in some bills for the purpose of trying to both give it resources and give it the actual strength that it would need to be able to hold law enforcement accountable. Part of the problem is that because it has relatively little power, and in fact, I think one of the greatest illustrations of its lack of power, as I understand it, when the Civilian Review Board makes a recommendation that comes as a result of a complaint made to it, the police commissioner is not obligated to act on it, right? And so they're literally just making suggestions. They don't have any actual power. The commissioner is under no obligation to honor anything the Civilian Review Board does. And so I think the work on that is to try to build, give it resources, to give it the power that it needs to be able to conduct its business, give it structurally, it delineate its independence, right? So that it can't be kind of politically manipulated by an administration that may want to protect its police commissioner. And I think it's also important that, that an entity like that can only work well if it has the resources to be able to do its job. And so when you contrast the Civilian Review Board, which was severely underfunded, with the police department, I think it's $500 million. What that allocation suggests is that it's not a priority. And so I think that's the work that needs to be done on the Civilian Review Board.
Bobby, can I ask, Jill might know, I looked at the numbers a few years ago. It like 1 or 2 cases, or maybe 0 cases. Oh, Jill, how often does the police department take the recommendation of the Civilian Review Board?
None, but I was there. They prided themselves because I for a brief time, I had oversight of the Civilian Review Board when I was Director of Civil Rights for Baltimore City Office of Civil Rights. And a couple of things were in play. We were post-consent decree, so there was more public awareness of what was going on and more like interest in what police were doing. Also, I was there known to be, vocal about policing and transparency. And so while I was there as director, they changed decisions 3 times in honor of what the Civilian Review Board recommended. But the part that has often been left out of the story is that in each instance, the officer was ineligible to receive discipline. They'd either already retired or died. So it was, a toothless tiger. They didn't do anything. And since I've been gone, I'm guessing they've gone back to their old ways. I doubt that they've honored the Civilian Review Board at all.
I definitely wanted to get into a little bit of the DOJ report and the consent decree and where we are now. but I want to give folks time to ask questions to the panelists. So please, folks, if you can unmute yourself. If you do not feel comfortable with speaking, please feel free to post your question in the chat, and I'll definitely pose it to our panelists. A first question that came from Laditra Johnson. She said, how can we assist reform efforts if we are unable to attend Senate hearings? Senate hearings are public. I'm just need, can you provide clarification, Laditra? Are you referring to Senate hearings during the actual legislative sessions?
Just if time constraints don't allow us to be able to attend, what ways can we assist?
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for clarification.
I'm actually typing a response, but so if you can't attend, the biggest thing you can do is contact your specific legislators, let them know you are their constituent, you are a person that votes for them and has power along with others to keep them in office or not, and that a litmus test for you is going to be how they vote on these bills, how they champion these bills, how they advocate for these bills. And another thing is legislators respond, even the leaders respond to public criticism. And so if you are on Twitter or Facebook and you can contact your legislators directly, then you should do that. You should ask them straight out, are you in support of repealing the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights? My vote for you depends on it. That is important. Social media, writing them directly. Some people say call. I'll be honest with you. That's been a narrative for a long time. Call your legislator. It's true that staff will answer the call and may log in how many people call on an issue. But I really think that these days, the emails, the writing is more important. You know, we keep a log of how many people have written about this. We keep a log of how many of them are actual constituents. I don't think calling is quite as effective as writing to legislators anymore. And that's just my opinion. And then I think hitting them on social media. And then if you have any writing skills, write about it. Write comments on your own social media. Write and send something in, letter to the editor to the Sun, the Afro. It's important to keep it in the narrative so they know they can't hide from the issue. Those are my suggestions.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to chime in with a question? Nancy Larkins asks, what is the purpose of the newly proposed administrator who responds to the mayor? Why is this person significant?
Is that in reference to the thing about the city administrator charter amendment that went through the council? Is that what that's related to?
She said yes. Yep.
Yeah, I don't know that that'll touch policing at all. It's a trend in progressive cities to separate or to have a person whose job is to just do the administrative work, so that the mayor does the visionary stuff. But that doesn't touch policing, as far as I understand it.
Thank you, Devon. Anyone else?
I have a quick question. Thank you all for sharing. It seems like just the whole issue with policing is something that's not going to change, right? And so sometimes it seems like certain structures or policies won't change. So what do you guys propose, or maybe this isn't the right platform for it, for communities to really begin to protect and preserve themselves, right? To buffer against these larger systems that might not change for a while. Kind of how people speak about creating your own infrastructure to sustain your community as far as like food sovereignty, education. I do believe even with the Black Panthers, they were creating an infrastructure to protect our own. And again, this is probably not the best platform for it, but I do think that it's time to start talking about it.
I agree with you, and I actually support the Panther method. The problem is that I think that we are so far removed and often in community from those kinds of tactics that it might be hard to pull off. I mean, we may not be able to actually follow police around and, you know, have licenses to wear and carry and pull a gun on them when they see them harassing our people, but, or even film them, which is also helpful. But I do think that it is important, you know, the concept of, and like in my community now, we have a neighborhood watch group. I think that it would be important. I think it's a great idea to start your own police watch group in your community, because you have to be in numbers when you are overseeing any activity of the police, because other than that, you could find yourself victimized yourself. So I think to build that in community is a very good step. And I think this is the right form. Because, I mean, the whole point of all of this is policing in its current form doesn't work at all. So we have to find ways to protect our neighborhood and also keep people safe.
One quick thing I want to add is that, because I agree with everything Senator Carter just mentioned about, you know, us having to do for ourselves. It's important that in doing that, which I think is central, like building infrastructure for us to be self-sufficient. It is important that we do not cede politics to the other side, right? Because the other side is using politics to impact things that affect our community, whether we like it or not. You know, so the police are going to be in our neighborhoods, whether we like it or not. And so the pressure that we put on them at least gives us some ability and some leverage to be able to check the impact that the system has on our communities. So I think it's important for us to think about them as complementary to each other. We build for ourselves, we build the capacity to police ourselves and police the police, but we also need to engage the political structure and the political system. And because we don't want to just we don't want to cede that to them, because if we do that, then, you know, they're going to be able to do things uninhibited to our communities.
Thank you.
We have a question from Sister Kenya P. She just wants to hear the panel's thoughts on defunding the police. That's our first question. Second question is, how do we push legislation to support entrepreneurship and home ownership so that our power is seen as collective in our community?
Can I really briefly, because that reminds me of something that I thought of earlier when Davon said that in Baltimore City, the police gets a third of the city's budget. I was on a call today to discuss a legislative audit of Baltimore Police Department, and the legislative auditor said that the last numbers that they had was that Baltimore City Police Department actually was funded between federal grants and those kinds and programs and additional monies, in addition to the fact that they get about $500,000 from their budget initially, and then they come back, you know, every few months to ask for more money for overtime and this and that and the other thing. But between all of the money that goes to them for personnel and all of the money that goes to them for equipment and all of these other grant programs, that they're funded to the tune of about $2 billion, $500 million, I'm sorry, $2 billion. And any narrative from a police department in Baltimore City that starts with, we need more money or we need more officers, to hire more officers, is a false narrative, okay? All you have to do is not listen to me or anyone else, just look at the numbers. There's no legitimacy to the idea that the police are in any way underfunded or need more money for anything. And so this narrative, and I'll let others talk about it, this narrative about defunding the police is simply saying, take the money away from an ineffective entity that isn't protecting our communities and isn't serving public safety, and put it into, give the resources to other programs and organizations that actually will work. Put it to mental health, put it to interveners, interrupters of violence, put it to places where it's going to serve people. I would add, put it to treatment on demand and those kinds of things, rather than continue to give it to an ineffective entity that doesn't serve us and actually can harm us.
The only thing I'll add is that even this, the current movement, the defund the police movement, it's also not new. I mean, Senator Carter and working closely with Davon at LBS has been working on statewide legislation to fund violence interrupters for at least a few years. And so, there's very little that is original in this moment, right? And the only thing that would be truly original, if you will, is for our elected leaders to actually move on it, and what Senator Carter mentioned earlier about the General Assembly being leadership driven, I think it's fundamentally just undemocratic. It's fundamentally undemocratic that you have, I mean, and I appreciate that it's necessary to have, presiding officers of both chambers, but the level of influence and, elbow twisting that happens in Annapolis is just unacceptable. It's unacceptable, and it amounts to a dilution of certain communities' votes when you have legislators who, because they are standing by what their communities are asking for, like Senator Carter and a few others have been doing, that makes them less in the favor of the presiding officers or the leadership of the General Assembly. So I'll just circle back to your first question about the defunding movement. I think it's, it sort of, it feels catchy in the moment, but there are folks who have been working to invest in community-based solutions to public safety for a long time before this moment.
So if I could just add a couple of things to that. One of the things that I was having a conversation with somebody, a gentleman in his 80s who happened to have known Senator Carter's father. And, we were talking about defund police. And as you mentioned, Bobby, Walter Carter was a social worker. And what we discussed, he said, because the gentleman that I was talking to himself was a human service provider. He mentioned that in the 70s, he remembers that there was a federally funded program within the Baltimore City Police Department that when 911 was called, that and it wasn't a life-threatening situation, that people like him and others would go to the scene, right, to what was happening instead of police. And he said what ended up happening was that when the federal money dried up, so basically when the Reagan administration came in and the federal funding dried up for that, instead of the city or the state picking up the tab, the city just funded the police to do it, right? And so a part of the reason why I bring that up is to say, not to Tony's point, not only is it like not new, but it's something that has been done before, right? In terms of having alternatives to public safety. Unfortunately, I just think Americans in general don't honor history to the way they were supposed to. And in fact, me and Senator Carter are gonna make an appointment in August sometime to look through some of her pop's papers to try to, get that information and see like, how can we take what was done before and use it to develop an alternative to public safety. The other thing I want to say about that is that when we talk about O'Malley and him becoming mayor during that period of time, part of the issue is that if you have people who live in communities that they're fundamentally unsafe, and you say more police or less police, right, and those are the only two options you give them, they're going to say more police, right? And so I think a part of what organizations like mine and others working with others are, our task is to help to provide support for, and this is what Tony was talking about a moment ago, we need to find support for the variety of organizations that do anti-violence work in Baltimore and begin to build up their capacity to do it on a scale where people can begin to imagine a world where police are obsolete. And I think that's where defund police needs to go. And that's where we've been trying to go for a while. But I think that's really the key is how do we invest in an ecosystem of organizations that do the job of public safety so well that police become extreme to us in terms of why they show up in our daily lives.
So reimagining what public safety look like for our communities. Thank you, appreciate it. Darnell Wharton wanted to share more about his work with the community engagement arm, the consent decree, the monitoring team. Darnell, real quickly, can you chime in and discuss that more? Unmute yourself, brother.
Can you hear me, Bobby?
Yep.
All right. How's everybody doing? So my name is Darnell Wharton. I'm with the consent decree monitoring team, the community engagement arm. We have 9 neighborhood liaisons in each police district. Our job simply is to get the information out about the consent decree and get information back from residents on police interactions in their area ever since the consent decree was brought into play. Our issue right now is we're out there, we've been out there for 3 years, but because there wasn't a big rollout from the city, from BPD on what the consent decree is, what it's about, how it's supposed to help, how it's supposed to mend the gap between police and the residents, we spend more of our time trying to explain it to people than telling them about, hey, these are the rights that you have, and this is the power that you have when you complain about what's going on in your community, or if you even want to give a praise report. But that's what we mostly do. We don't have as many neighborhood liaisons we're supposed to have. We got 9 right now, 1 for each district, and some of these districts are huge. But we've been out there for 3 years, and we're making some headway because there are a lot of residents who now recognize that, hey, I can talk to this person about a consent decree. And pre-COVID, they were set up in certain areas in their districts where you can come and talk to them for about a couple hours to get any questions answered. But at this particular time, when it comes to police reform, not a lot of our residents really know what's going on with the consent decree and why the consent decree is here and what are police supposed to be doing after they get these trainings. And a lot of our residents are sitting here having dealt with unconstitutional practices for the past 40 to 50 years. And when they hear about a consent decree and the reform policies as far as stop searches and arrests and transportation and technology, they're looking for it to be immediate, like, okay, it needs to be done right now. And I understand that, and we understand that. What I'm trying to get is, how do I or my team, what can be done for us to be able to know that we're out there and we want to talk about this police reform, and we're saying that, these are the things that are being put in place, and these are the things that when you make a complaint, instead of what used to happen, this is what's supposed to happen. If it's not happening, I am the person, or my neighborhood liaison person, that you can talk to because I have the ear to the judge. So if you tell me what's going on, I can tell the judge, and the judge can lean on the major of that particular district and say, hey, this is not happening and this is supposed to be happening. The rollout for the consent decree was very, very, very minimal. My team is not really a part of DOJ or the city or BPD. We're the monitor who sits away and just monitors what's going on. However, when we're out there, people are looking forward to us, like saying, okay, y'all are who y'all are. Y'all supposed to be helping us. I'm like, we can't investigate, but I can help you if something happened during your block and you felt like you were treated unconstitutionally. You give me a complaint and I can take it to the judge. We can get it happening. But because the way that the consent decree was minimally rolled out, a lot of residents, over maybe 3/4 of them, have no idea what the consent decree is.
I got it. May I address it? And let me start by saying is a chance, a strong likelihood you are not going to like my answer. This is my answer, what I believe to be the truth. The reason for the rollout being minimal was intentional because the consent decree entire process is a racket. Not saying any of you are part of a racket or you are contributing to a racket. You're well-intentioned people that want to serve the community. But the very way this was set up, the lack of publicity was intentional. The disconnected monitoring team under which you work was intentional. There are people who play footsie with Judge Bradar, big deal, big wigs from big law firms, and these out of touch, disconnected people from out of state. They go from state to state, city to city, wherever there's a consent decree, and get to be part of a team so they can make millions of dollars over the course of the life of the consent decree. So the reason for that is the consent decree is a racket. And those people, the monitoring team, they're making so much money to just run up to Judge Bradar every now and then and tell Judge Bradar, this is the progress, and Judge Bradar to yell and say, you're not moving fast enough. And, you know, at the end of it, they'll maybe extend it so they get even more money. So what would I suggest that you do? You've got to go public about the fact that this is where we are. I mean, you can go directly to Judge Bradar, but you can also, you know, contact media. You can, I think that silence is a problem here. The fact that people don't know, you can make a little bit more noise so that people do know. You can make a little bit noise about how the process is not working, because one thing that they don't like is negative publicity. So you come out, the people that do the neighborhood liaison or the work that you do, come out and tell your truth about how you need more resources for the publicity around this. Judge Bradar will act, most likely, but he's never going to act if there isn't negative publicity, because the only thing Judge Bradar and these monitoring team people that are getting multi-millions of dollars care about is the public perception that they are at least doing the bare minimum of work that they're supposed to do. And so it's important that our residents know that. And you said, if you hear a complaint, go to the judge. The question that I have is, because I would think and hope that they would be advised to go both to the Civilian Review Board and to the Police Internal Affairs, or what do they call it, the Integrity Unit now, to make their complaint at not one, but both if the complaint qualifies for both. Because I know the monitoring team can't do anything except keep a log of, we had this number of complaints, but they can't do anything, they can't fix anything. So I appreciate the work you're doing, but I don't think going along, getting along, and just doing what you're supposed to do is gonna help you make progress. I think you've got to make a ruckus around the fact that you're 3 years into this thing and people still don't know what is going on. The resources are there because Ken Thompson is getting paid millions of dollars. And what's the guy's name? The officer that I forget his name right now. You know, the main officer that came in to do the decree, nice old guy, kind of like Harrison. No, he's getting paid millions of dollars, but where's the money for the public relations? Where's the money for the communications to inform the people? That should be a part of this. And so I think you make a ruckus, you make them do something about it, and maybe you'll make some progress there.
Right.
And that's going to have to be the closing thought. Definitely going to have to be the closing thought. Want to be respectful of people's time. Really briefly, each panelist, can you give a closing statement as briefly as in like 20, 30 seconds? And I'm going to toss it back to Madam President Amanda. Also, if you all can include how folks can get in contact with you and learn more about your work, support your work, folks, support LBS, see how contact Senator Carter's office and see how you can support and because she needs it in Annapolis, because she's one of the real true and honest warriors we have advocating for us in Annapolis. So contact the office, see how you can support her action. Also reach out to Tony Holness to see how you can support her action and her advocacy in Annapolis. Folks, they've been doing the work for years, but they definitely, we need to have their backs, bottom line. We need to have their backs in this work. So really quickly, within 20 seconds, just give closing statements.
I'll just quickly say, lbsbaltimore.com, LBS Baltimore, all your relevant social media. Contact your legislators during session. You'll be hearing from LBS about, the things that are going to be happening and where we need you all to help support for pressure. So look out for that. Check us out, like our pages, keep up with us. Thanks for the opportunity.
Bobby, I'd just say, if you want to get engaged with some of the work that the ACLU is doing, quite honestly, when it comes to policing, we're in lockstep with LBS, so you could just go ahead and connect with Davon. As folks know, I will be leaving the ACLU of Maryland towards the end of the month, but if you want to stay in contact with the institution of the ACLU, the website is www.aclu-md.org.
Senator Carter, you put your, okay, go ahead, Senator Carter.
Put it in the chat real quick. I'll be really quick. I was gonna say, Tony, I was leaving this on a good note, but now you just made me depressed.
I know, right?
ACLU is really, really a loss. It's going to be a huge loss. I've been doing everything in my power to figure out how to get it to stay at least through one more session. I put my information in the chat. This is just my own personal interest. I like Twitter. It's my only social media I enjoy. So if you're not on Twitter, I encourage everybody always to get on Twitter. To me, it's the only one that really matters. It's like the one where you can tweet directly to your legislator, directly to the reporter, directly to whoever you want to tweet to. It's effective, more effective to me than some of the others. So get on Twitter, Jill P. Carter. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And now I'm gonna toss it to Madam President Amanda Morgan Henry. Madam President.
I am here. Thank you all for participating in this panel. I didn't have any questions because I was sitting here just processing information, and maybe that is what other people are doing. As a social worker, if I'm candid, a lot of times we don't, and as a social worker and as a social work educator, we don't do enough in our education of social workers to really train social workers to do enough of this policy work. That's just my personal opinion. Most people get involved, become social workers because they want to be clinicians. That's usually the thing that they think of first. And so as much as we can as a chapter, as an organization here in Baltimore, that are as African-centered, very pro-Black, and very much empowering Black people and making sure that our rights, that our rights are secure, that we want to promote as much as possible that social workers get involved at the policy level, because we're needed. We have perspective, because we work with, we're there, we're in community, we're working with people, families, children in different ways. And so, just as from the social work perspective, please know that this is our conversation. This is not a conversation that doesn't have, that we should not be heavily involved in. And as much as a chapter, we have linked and we partner with LBS. We are partnering with other organizations to, and we'll have more dialogue like this and more opportunity for you to become more hands-on involved in the work that needs to be done. And so I do thank everybody for their interest, for being here, and especially our panelists for the work that you continue to do. Our chapter, as an affiliate of the National Association of Black Social Workers, we always are looking for members or people to join us in the work that we do. I will be clear that our membership criteria is that you are Black and about it. That's how I summarize it. You just need to be Black and about it. You don't have to be a social worker. You just have to be Black and about community and about the empowerment and the strengthening of Black people. And so our website is BaltimoreABSW.com. We have some upcoming events. We do have another event on Saturday at 12. Vacants in the Village. Am I saying that right, Bobby? Vacants in the Village, which is really, it's with Fight Blight Baltimore organization here in the city, that is really about inequities in housing and community development. And this particular workshop is going to be done by Nika Namdi, who, if you haven't heard Nika speak or met her, you need to show up because you need to hear that. But she will be talking about how to have us save our family homes and just the things that we need to be doing as Black people to build to be sustainable on our own. I think Dave all mentioned that earlier, just how do we create opportunities for us to sustain ourselves as a collective, and this is one of those opportunities to learn how to do that. And so please keep in touch with us. Please check our website. We are Baltimore ABSW on Instagram, as well as on Facebook. And there will be some other panels specifically coming up about more about police reform and social policy and tangible things that we're going to be doing as a chapter. So again, thank you so very much. Thank you, Bobby, too, for mentioning it for certain, for calling the name of Walter P. Carter as a social work ancestor and activist. Thank you, Senator Carter, for being here and continuing his work in real life and keeping his spirit absolutely present. Thank you, Davon, for always showing up, always showing up. And thank you so much, Tony. Haven't met you, and everybody's like, "Oh my gosh, she's leaving." But definitely appreciated your thoughts and your candor about what's been happening. So. If there just as some logistics, those of you, first of all, we appreciate everybody's feedback. So if I put a link in the chat to our evaluation for our panel, because we love your feedback. We want to know what we can do better. If there's anything, please complete that. If you are requesting CEUs, you must complete the evaluation to receive your CEUs. So please do so. And you should receive an email this evening, everybody, with that link in it as well, if you did not get it from the chat. And so thank you so very much. We will look forward to seeing you all at the next, our next conversation, and hopefully at some other events and things that we will be doing for community. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.